during some hellish 15 months of persecution and wrongful accusations, and it all began when 3 small children accused their maid, Tituba, of bewitching them all. Sheriff George Corwin, responsible for many of those trials and their punishments, was an inhumane, vile being, the definition of cruelty at a man's unforgiving fingertips. One of his last victims cursed the sheriff with his last dying breath, with so much efficacy, in fact, that every Salem sheriff thereafter seemed to be cursed as well, dying suddenly or painfully from a heart or blood disease. Giles Corey was one of 6 men who died during the trials that ran from May through October of 1692. He was the only one tortured, the rest either hung or perishing whilst in jail. Implicated by Abigail Hobbs, the Coreys were all brought to justice at one time, and Giles even began by himself accusing his wife of witchcraft, testifying against her also. He later attempted to recant his testimony, but to no avail. Their destinies had been decided for them, and the result would be appalling. People now believe that Giles Corey, realizing what would befall his family, acted out not in sheer rebellion, knowing he would die, but out of pure speculated intelligence, as an attempt to save his remaining family's wealth, although far and few, and their property. The laws of the time dictated that whomever was accused of witchcraft would lose all their holdings, leaving nothing for those who stood worthy to an inheritance. Once accused, Giles knew that pleading innocent would not only lead to his death, but would most likely lead to his conviction anyway. As such, and in an attempt to save his belongings for his 2 son-in-laws to inherit, Corey refused to plead neither guilty or innocent, opting instead to remain silent in a legal twist, preventing his possessions of being awarded to the colony after his death, no matter how he died. The solution to Corey's refusal to the court was, as perceived by Sheriff Corwin, the son of the witch trials magistrate Jonathan Corwin, to torture him thoroughly until he chose to plead either innocent or guilty of all charges. Corwin had been profiting largely from the Salem witch trials, as it was he who was in charge of confiscating the convicts' property and possessions, later dividing it amongst the leaders of Salem. Despite it being illegal in the Massachusetts colony at the time, the court ordered Corey a sentence worse than death. He was to be pressed and crushed by stones until he chose to confess. In all of U.S. history, Giles Corey is the only person to ever be pressed to death by the order of a court of law. Sheriff Corwin not only witnessed the torture, as he also commandeered it from up close, his 4 men loyally following his orders, and each time pressing more weight onto the old man's body. Giles Corey was slowly crushed to death in a field just outside the old Salem jail, a field that is now known as Howard Cemetery. A board was placed upon his chest, encompassing his body, and slowly loaded with heavy field stones, one after another, upon the sheriff's command. Blood began pouring out of every orifice in his body, as bones and internal organs were slowly crushed. According to tradition and those who witnessed the ordeal, it took Corey 2 days to die under those unforgiving and horrible circumstances. A tale is told of how, in his last moments, Giles' tongue peered out of his mouth from the overbearing weight being pressed onto his body, and Sheriff Corwin, despicable in nature, brought his walking stick into the man's mouth, popping his tongue back in with the filthy tip of his cane. Folklore has it that Corey spoke only to ask for more weight, an act of defiance of when asked to plead by the sheriff. His final words were an outspoken curse to the vile man and the whole of Salem. Once he was finally dead, they buried him in an unmarked grave on Gallows Hill, as it was customary to do with those accused of witchcraft and conveying with the dark arts. According to local Salem historian and former sheriff himself, Robert Cahill, the curse seemed to be quite effective, perhaps even too much, as it seemed to target every sheriff that came after George Corwin. Each and every sheriff, starting with him, had either died in office or were forced into early retirement due to a heart or blood illness. Corwin died of a heart attack in 1696, and Cahill himself left his post after his own heart attack much more recently. This long-lasting and infamous curse seems to go beyond the post of sheriff, however, as whenever a tragedy befalls Salem, people claim to see Giles Corey's spirit looming in town soon after. During the time of his trials, a woman named Anne was even quoted as saying that, before Corey's death, a spectral vision of him had visited her, enticing her to write her name in the Book of the Devil. Giles Corey's ghost is said to enjoy, witness, and cause much of the tragedy that still happens in Salem nowadays.